למה אדוני תעמוד ברחוק, תעלים ליטות בצרה. על מני יצר רשע, אלוהים אמר בליבו לא תדרוש. שבור זרוע רשע, ורע תדרוש רישו, ואל תמצא.
Why, Adonai, do you remain so distant, so silent in times of trouble? Why should the wicked be allowed to scoff at God, saying to themselves that you will not notice? Break the might of the wicked, search out their hidden evil. We go to the next page, please. Abba Kovner, whose reading we're going to read responsively, was a Hebrew poet and a Yiddish poet, one of the great ones of the 20th century. But he also played an extraordinary role. He was the first to speak and write about the final solution in the Kovno ghetto. And the world refused to hear him. And he remained a powerful voice during the Shoah and afterwards. But what would have happened had people listened, had people heard? So I'm going to invite you to read with me responsibly, even though I know you're muted, but I want to participate with you together. We shall remember our brothers and sisters, the houses of the city and the houses of the country, the streets of the shtetl, streaming like rivers, and the lonely inn on the main road.
The face of the old man, the mother in her kerchief, the young girl with braids, and the infant.
The thousands of communities of Israel amid the families of the earth.
All the congregations of Jews who were slaughtered on the soil of Europe by the Nazi murderer.
The man who suddenly screamed and while screaming died, the woman who clutched her child to her bosom, but her arms could not hold her.
The baby whose fingers explored his mother's nipple, but it was blue and cold.
The feet that sought to flee, but found no refuge.
And those who shaped their hands into a fist, the fist that grasped the iron that became the weapon of vision, despair, and rebellion.
And they, the strong of heart, open-eyed, freely offered up their lives, but were unable to bring salvation.
We shall remember the day in its brightness, the sun that rose upon the bloody scene, the heavens that stood high and silent.
We shall remember the mounds of dust under the blooming gardens.
The living shall remember the dead, for they are before us always.
Their eyes, glancing round and round, give us no peace, until our lives become worthy of their memory. We go to the next page. We look to the Hazkara, the El Maleh Rachamim prayer, as we remember those who were murdered in the Shoah. We rise.
El Maleh Rachamim, שוכן במרומים, דיין אלמנות ואבי יתומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה תחת כנפי השכינה. במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרפיות מסיירים ונשמות רבבות אלפי אנשים, נשים וטף, שנהרגו ושנשחטו, שנשרפו, שנחנקו ושנקברו חיים בידי המרצחים הרשעים ומוגי לב יימח שמם. בעבור איך שכולנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אנא בעל הרחמים, תסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, ותצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם, ארץ אל תחסי דמם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותם, ונאמר
Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure. To the souls of all our brethren who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered, suffocated, and burned to ashes, may their memories endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. May their souls thus be bound up in the bond of eternal life. May they rest b'shalom, may they rest in peace. And to that we can all say, Amen.
Amen.
I invite you to join in the Kaddish in memory of the Shoah. Kazan will chant the Aramaic, and I'll invite you to join with me as we walk through the killing fields of the Shoah.
Yitkadal,
Auschwitz,
Yitkadash,
Lodz,
Shemei Rabbi,
Ponar,
Bi'alema divrach chirutei,
Babi Yar,
V'yamlich malechutei,
Maidanek,
B'chayechon u'v'yomechon,
Erchanau,
ובחיי דכל בית ישראל,
Kovno,
בגלה בזמן קריב,
Yanauska,
ואמרו אמן. יהי שמירה מברך, לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה. יתברך וישתבח,
Theresienstadt,
יתפאר ויתרומם,
Buchenwald,
יתנשא ויתהדר,
Treblinka,
יתעלה ויתהלל,
Vilna,
שמי קודשה
Bergen-Belsen,
בריחו ליילו,
Mauthausen,
כל ברכתה ושירתה
Dachau.
שבחתה ונחמתה
Minsk.
גם איראן ביולמה
Warsaw.
ואמרו יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו
I am reminded of the story of the rabbis who put God on trial for breaking the covenant with the people of Israel while they were in one of the death camps. They found God guilty of breaking the covenant, of not living up to God's end of the covenant, the brit, that was first made with Abraham and concretized at Sinai. And when they finished with their verdict, they looked to one another and said, it's time to daven mincha. It's time to offer the afternoon service. While we are angry, we never lose faith. We never lose the belief that God is ultimately the Shomer Yisrael. And we believe that God is that, and that God will be that, and that there is a better day in the future. But it cannot be created without memory and without taking those souls who were killed for the crime of being a Jew with us in our memories as we go forward. So we join together in singing Shomer Yisrael. Naomi, would you lead us?
Sure. Okay. Shomer, Shomer Yisrael, Shemor Sherit Yisrael. Shomer, Shomer Yisrael, Shemor Sherit Yisrael. Ve'ayovad, Ve'ayovad Yisrael, Ve'ayovad, Ve'ayovad Yisrael ha'omrim, ha'omrim, ha'omrim Shema Yisrael. Shomer, Shomer, Goy Echad, Shemor Sherit Am Echad. Shomer, Shomer, Goy Echad, Shemor Sherit Am Echad. Ve'ayovad, Ve'ayovad, Goy Echad, Ve'ayovad, Ve'ayovad, Goy Echad, Am Yachadim. Shimcha, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Shomer, Shomer, Goy Kadosh, Shemor She'erit Am Kadosh. Shomer, Shomer, Goy Kadosh, Shemor She'erit Am Kadosh. Ve'ayovad, Ve'ayovad, Goy Kadosh, Ve'ayovad, Ve'al yovad goy kadosh hamshalshim. V'shalosh kedushot lekadosh.
Friends, you may be seated. I want to thank everyone for participating in our service and thank all of you for joining us this evening. I'm going to introduce Father John Pawlikowski in a moment, and we're going to engage in a dialogue about Amalek and what we have learned, and what we haven't learned since the Shoah, and lessons that we need to think about in our day. But what we'd like to do is, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a chat with a little bubble on top. If you press that, you'll see that you can type a message in the chat box or a question. So during the course of our conversation, if you'd like to ask a question, I'm going to pay attention to it. I know Amy will pay attention to it as well. And Father Pawlikowski hopefully can do that as well. And we'll try and kind of include some of the questions in our dialogue this evening. So that's how we'll do it. I don't want to, the sound becomes really impossible if you release everyone to speak at the same time. So we're going to try to do it through the chat, and we'll pay attention to the questions as we go along. It is our distinct honor to welcome a good friend to not only the Anshe Emet synagogue, but the Jewish people at large. Truly one of the Chasidei Umot Olam, one of the true righteous Gentiles in our time, Father John Pawlikowski. A book I would recommend to you is entitled Writing Relations After the Holocaust and Vatican II, Essays in Honor of John T. Pawlikowski. It is a remarkable work, and the essays are written by some of the most important interreligious scholars in the world today, all in honor of our guest this evening. And in the foreword, Judith Banke, who is the senior advisor on interreligious affairs at the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Studies, writes the following. It is almost impossible to summarize Father Dr. Professor John Pawlikowski's monumental contribution to Jewish Christian understanding and rapprochement, Holocaust studies, and the theological, historical, and ethical dimensions of our joint and separate teaching traditions. His condensed biography on the Scarborough Mission's website makes an excellent attempt at saying it all. It is hard to find an English language book on Jewish-Christian relations written in the last 30 years that does not either reference or include a contribution from Servite Father John Pawlikowski, one of the most prolific and respected contemporary writers and speakers on the Holocaust and the dramatic change in Christian attitudes towards Jews in the decades since the Second World War. High praise and deserved praise. John Pawlikowski was born in 1940, is a Servite friar priest, professor emeritus of social ethics, and former director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program, part of the Bernardine Center for Theology and Ministry at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. He's currently in residence at Assumption Church in River North section of Chicago. As a member of Catholic Theological Union since 1968, Pawlikowski was appointed to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council in 1980 by then President Jimmy Carter. He was subsequently reappointed by Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. As of 2008, he chaired the council's subcommittee on church relations and served on its executive committee, the Committee on Conscience, an academic committee. And Father Pawlikowski also served as president of the International Council of Christians and Jews, the ICCJ, from 2002 to 2008. Welcome, Father John Pawlikowski. We are so very honored to have you with us this evening.
Indeed, honored to join you this evening for the important work of not only discussing Christian-Jewish relations, but of honoring the victims of the Holocaust. I have taken deep into me the remark made by my longtime friend, who I got to know in my work at the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, the late Elie Wiesel, who said, "If we forget the victims, we in fact kill them a second time."
Beautifully said. Let me begin by thanking you for your important work and the stands that you've taken. You have really, you were not part of the Nostra Aetate writing, but the reality is that you have done as much as anyone to bring that remarkable document to fruition. And so on behalf of the Jewish people, on behalf of our congregation, we thank you for all that you've done. And if we were in a room together, we would call for a standing ovation. But please know that it comes from our heart this evening. So let's begin. And the questions are large and they are powerful, but we are living in an age when anti-Semitism is being seen around the globe in ways that most of us could not have imagined. We are living in the midst of a pandemic where all kinds of moral questions are being raised. From your perspective, what are some of the most important moral lessons to be learned from the experience of the Shoah?
I think, first of all, we have to recognize that the way God created the universe, he did it in such a way that the human community shared with God a strong responsibility for its future. God will not save the planet, the world, the human community, all creation, solely by himself. We have to become what the late Pope John Paul II called co-creators. We share with God a responsibility to act as God's co-creators and protectors. And we have to stand up right now, both because of what we've seen in the Holocaust, in other genocides, and increasingly, since I will mention this, since we are celebrating this week also, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, our increased responsibility for the protection of the entire planet, for the care of creation. And those are awesome responsibilities. I remember one of the most powerful experiences I had was at a conference in, I believe, 1979 in Los Angeles, where Hans Jonas, who was not a Holocaust survivor, but someone who escaped Germany because of the Nazi upsurge, went to the New School of Social Research in New York and wrote both about the Holocaust and about human responsibility. His major work is called The Imperative of Human Responsibility, but it's based on a lecture he gave at that conference in Los Angeles. And that legacy of that conference has stuck with me forever, because Jonas said that we have reached a point in the development of humanity that we are not so sure anymore that there will be a future generation, that we have to guarantee through our work a future generation. And that is something that also comes forth from our understanding of moral responsibility in light of the Holocaust. So we need to become what some groups call upstanders against anti-Semitism and other forms of social hatred.
So both in terms of our moral choices, but also in terms of our treatment of the world, free will matters. God has placed within our hands the ability to create a moral universe. God has also given us the power to disassemble the universe. And that is a powerful that's a powerful lesson in the world in which we live, because God is not going to save us the way that we would like to believe. We have the power to destroy the world, and God is not going to be there to pick up the pieces for us. So I guess a question that follows then is, what lessons do you think were not learned from the Shoah?
I think that we have not adequately reflected on how we basically perceive God and the divine presence in human society. And this again is an issue. There are, right during this crisis, people are doing harmful things out of religion in some cases. And frankly, this applies to part of the Christian community, more the parts of the Christian evangelical community, as well as a part of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. And that is that we say, well, God will save us. We don't have to obey the scientists and the doctors and so on. God will save us. We've, I think, fallen into a path in Western society in particular, if I can put it bluntly, overestimating the power of God, or the willingness at least of God to use all the power that he or she might have. I remember my good friend Herman Schaumann, who was just a little bit north of you for many years at Emmanuel Congregation. And he and I had many discussions about the Holocaust and how it impacts our understanding of God. And Herman used to shock people, and he even did it one night on Chicago Tonight, on the television program on the local PBS channel, when he told the interviewer that he didn't believe in God after the Holocaust. Well, the interviewer almost fell out of the chair. But what he was trying to say
as did most of the Jewish community, by the way.
Right, and what I found very interesting is this concept that one finds in part of Jewish mystical literature, where God kind of, after creation, sort of pushes back and almost contracts himself in order to let the human community run the show, if you want to put it that way, far more. We in the West have kind of been, I think, unfortunately, over-dependent on an Aristotelian notion of God as the all-powerful, the almighty, the one with no limitations. But God does have, I think, maybe self-imposed limitations, but they are limitations. And I think we need to rethink and reflect, not only in light of the Shoah, but in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, our understanding of God. I believe in God as a strong, caring presence, but I think we cannot believe in God in the way that says to us, oh, we don't have to do anything to take care of instances of human degradation or creational degradation. We really need to take back, to strengthen, to internalize far more than we often have our responsibility that is shared with the divine. I remember just reflecting some years ago when a tsunami hit Thailand, and there was an interview with a young woman who survived. She and her boyfriend were in a resort swimming pool when the waves of water went over them. She held on to him for a while, but their hands broke apart, and he perished and she lived. And she said, "Oh, thank God, I was saved by the Lord." Well, I can understand that feeling, but God didn't save her boyfriend. And I think we have to grapple with that much more than sometimes we care to. I reflected during the service about the notion of raising objections to God. I think this is something that Christians can learn from Judaism. You know, we have it in the book of Job. But even we have it, frankly, we have Jesus on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? You know, so there is even a residue of that kind of Jobian confrontation with God on the part of Jesus himself. And I think we have to realize that sometimes we have to challenge God. Elie Wiesel, again, in one of his writings, talks about the experience of clandestinely celebrating Shabbat by a few of the Jews every Friday in the concentration camps, in the death camps. And part of that was, you know, they almost said to God, you know, we shouldn't be doing this because look what has happened to us. We're supposed to be your chosen people. The covenant is supposed to be, the covenant established obligations on our part towards you, but it also established obligations from your side towards us, and you seem to have failed.
I want to interject here. This idea of Tzimtzum that you raised a minute ago, this mystical concept that in order for God to allow the world to be created, God had to remove God's self from the world. And that is a powerful concept, but Jewish mysticism, and this is really attached to Lurianic Kabbalah, is based on the idea that human beings also have the power to bring God back into the world. Right? We can light those sparks and ignite those sparks, the notzitzot, and God's presence comes with it, which speaks to the perennial question of where was God in Auschwitz? And the notion is that the question is two parts. The answer is two parts. Where was man? And the reality is that God was everywhere, to quote the Kutzker Rebbe, that people allowed God to be. We are, on the one hand, we bear the responsibility of free will, but at the same time, Father, I think that we also need to acknowledge human empowerment, that great religions, Catholicism and Judaism, right, are not only speaking about what it means to be a humble person in the face of God, but there's also this notion of empowerment, what you can and must do in the world to make it worthy of God's presence. Don't you think?
Exactly. I think, you know, one of the people who has influenced me the most over the years in terms of reflection on the Holocaust is Irving Greenberg, Yitz Greenberg. And I know his writings, you know, he took in his major writings, he's taken to critique the old covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish community, but he would even extend it to God and the human community, saying it's outdated. It doesn't really deal with the way we perceive the world today. Now, he was attacked by many, and not just from the right, but even from the left. I remember one of the strongest initial critiques of Greenberg's writing on the Holocaust came from Arnold Wolf. Now, Rabbi Arnold Wolf would never be classified as a right-wing conservative, to put it mildly.
Or a traditional thinker by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. But he said he thought that the way Greenberg sort of presented the new God, if you want, or the new image of God, was that God kind of created and then sat down in a big rocking chair and lit a big cigar and sort of let people take care of what he had created. Well, I mean, to some extent that's true, but I think we also have to find a way of God's presence. Now, for me, one of the most moving books on that subject from the Christian side, I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily what a Jew would find the most meaningful, is the book that came out well over a decade ago from the very prominent Protestant theologian in Germany, Jürgen Moltmann. And the title of the book was The Crucified God. Now, in part, he was, of course, picking up on a Christian image, one that the Christian community just recently celebrated, or at least tried to under the pandemic. But Moltmann wrote that book after a visit to Auschwitz. And he said, when I was there, and I asked myself, what can God mean in the midst of such genocide and such destruction of human life? He said, the only thing that I could say was that somehow God remains a suffering and caring presence. God is not going to necessarily be the one to overcome this, but God can stand and suffer along with those who are afflicted by such acts of major acts of destruction of humanity. And for me, that's probably the most powerful image of God that I can continue to retain. And I think it was the kind of image that my friend Herman Schaumann also in the end retained, even though he would startle people for the sake of discussion in part by saying, well, I don't believe in God anymore after the Shoah.
Although, I'm looking at some of the questions that have been posted, and in some ways, when Julianne Goldberg asks about how, please explain how humanity could continue to believe in God despite the Holocaust and all tragedies, in a sense, what I'm hearing your answer to that question to be, and part of my answer as well, is that if you believe that God is the all-powerful God who's going to come and split the sea in our day, then we're going to be sadly disappointed.
Exactly.
And rather, it is a God, a caring God who reminds us of who we can be, a God who continues to believe in us when we don't believe in ourselves, and a God who gives us strength when we don't believe we can have strength. And I think that helps to begin the formulation of that answer, and also the book that you made reference to about a God who suffers with us as well. But I also want to look at the question from Dr. Sarah Hirschhorn, and I'll read the question aloud. I was recently rereading the Symposium on Jewish Values in the Post-Holocaust Era, which includes Fackenheim's famous essay and his 11th commandment to not give Hitler a posthumous victory. What do you think our 12th commandment should be today, 75 years after Auschwitz? Did we ever fulfill 11? And now in the midst of this global pandemic. So it's a great question. What would you think the 12th commandment should be?
That we need to respect everyone's human dignity as an essential, central component of our faith perspective. For me, one of the lessons, the moral lessons coming from the HaShoah, is that every religious tradition needs to make the protection of human dignity, the assertion of human rights, central to their self-identity. We need to express our self-identity as religious people in a way that is inclusive and not in a way that excludes others who do not share that faith from our care and concern.
So, to use the biblical terminology, "V'ahavta l'reacha chamocha," love your neighbor, as Saul Lieberman translated, not love your neighbor as yourself, but love your neighbor because he or she is like you.
Well, that she or I'm a little uncomfortable with the term "like you," simply because that doesn't allow for diversity. But what I am saying is that we have to respect the basic human dignity of all people as part of their birthright.
But it has to be, that doesn't.
Human dignity does not depend on believing correctly from our perspective. That was the old Catholic view, that it was the basis of the famous syllabus of errors of Pope Pius IX, who referred to the notion of religious freedom as a satanic idea. And that was one of the major changes that took place at the Second Vatican Council. It was in the Catholic Church, in the document on religious liberty, which runs kind of together in many ways with Nostra Aetate, and which affirmed that it is no longer a matter of correct belief that gives another the fundamental human dignity. They are born with it, and we must respect that.
See, I would argue that that is exactly what Lieberman was getting at. That's the part that is like you, that essential human spark of God, I would say, and that if we can't recognize that at the onset, then there's nothing to build on.
Correct.
So,
well, there's also, in that context, we can also turn to someone like Emanuel Levinas, the Jewish philosopher and ethicist, who said, that I can only become my authentic self in the presence of your face. So that there's an inherent bonding, if you want, among people. And maybe today we would extend it somewhat even to the entirety of creation, but at least certainly for Levinas, who's becoming more influential, I think, here in the United States now. He was well known practically in the European continent, but not too much over here, either by Jews or by Christians or other people writing on religious studies. But he's become more important precisely because of this intimate connection between the other and myself, which is really critical in making myself fully myself. I'm truncated as a human person without the other.
Yeah, I had a conversation today with a medical ethicist. We were doing a podcast on medical ethics in the age of the coronavirus. And he quoted that exact piece from Levinas in a time when people are dying alone and they can't see the face even of those who are treating them, and what has been lost in that sense of human dignity at the end of a person's life.
Here in the Archdiocese of Chicago, Cardinal Supich has tried to deal with that reality by specially training some 24 priests who are authorized to attend to people at their deathbed in kind of in lieu of family. It's not a perfect solution, to be sure, but at least many family members now at least know there is someone there besides the medical staff. But the medical staff, let me say, in many cases is also serving this function and doing so in a very significant, profound way, which also takes a tremendous emotional toll on them.
I want to acknowledge that, Alan Mintz has brought up the image of God, and the fact that, does that notion of the image of God not guide us to act as both God and man, in that we should follow the moral and ethical values of our tradition? It's an interesting insight that being created in the image of God really means that we have to we have to be the voice of God and work with the hands of God, and kind of balance our humanness, in that nexus between God and humanity. I want to move forward, and I want to think a little bit more about the Shoah and the role of the church. And so I'll ask you this question, which is a hard one, I would imagine. What's the connection between classical Christian anti-Semitism and the Shoah? Can one say that while Christianity did not create the Holocaust, that was a product of the Third Reich, the dark history of Christian anti-Semitism may have made the Shoah possible?
Well, as you know, the tradition of Christian anti-Semitism really arose within what we call the patristic period. It was the important so-called fathers of the church, including St. Augustine, who created what in Latin is known as the adversus Judaeos tradition, the against the Jews tradition. Now, why they did this is not entirely clear. It's not really in the New Testament, although I think as we're coming to understand the New Testament far more in its Jewish context, we realize that many of the hostile terms and accusations against the so-called Jews in the New Testament, particularly the Gospel of John, really stem from internal Jewish debates especially among people who may have accepted Jesus, but who still considered themselves part of the Jewish community of the day.
Mm-hmm.
As you probably know, I'm sure you know, Rabbi, that there's been a lot of literature in recent years which really shows that the separation between the Jewish and Christian community really did not happen in one fell swoop. It occurred over a long period of time, certainly over 2 or 3 centuries, and in some places as late as the 5th century. And there are evidences in places like Antioch and elsewhere where Christians, but Christian Jews, continued to go to the synagogue. And they weren't, we don't know the details. We don't know whether they were honored guests or whether they fully participated in the activities, but they went and they weren't kicked out, and they weren't, so the notion that some had that the basic separation between Jews and Christians occurred as a result of decisions made at the so-called Council of Jerusalem on the Christian side and the Synod of Yavne on the Jewish side, both of which occurred in the 1st century of the Common Era, is no longer totally valid. Certainly those 2 decisions were instrumental in creating a separation, but the separation took a long time to mature. And so we have, I think we have then a question: why did the fathers of the church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, really of the Common Era, really began to have this very strong anti-Jewish dimension to their explanations of Christianity? It was more of a theological explanation. It wasn't a blood kind of libel. It wasn't a bio-racial kind of, although there was some antipathy in the Roman world towards the Jewish community, which the people who joined from the Greco-Roman world, the church, probably brought with them. But basically, in a sense, if you really read what the fathers of the church did, is they did not want to exterminate the Jews so much as to render them perpetually miserable and at the margins of society, together with the notion that they would never have a homeland of their own because of their failure to reject Christ. Now, in effect, this kind of anti-Judaism, that some would call it, helped undergird centuries of actual anti-Semitic attacks. We just came out of a week when in many parts of the Christian world, there were pogroms and there were attacks on synagogues. People would go out of services in Holy Week and attack the Jewish community, right, because that's the way they understood and St. Augustine was very central in creating this anti-Jewish tradition. Now, there were even Jewish scholars who have defended him, saying, well, he wasn't so bad because he really argued that Jews should be kept alive, because they should be kept alive in order to be a perpetual reminder to people of what happens to you if you don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. Right. So you too become miserable and marginal and so on, and you are not entitled to anything called the homeland. But what happened during the Nazi period is that a bioracial, what I would call a bioracial approach to anti-Semitism, which dominated Nazi ideology to the extent that we can call it an ideology, came together with this tradition. So while the people who instigated the Holocaust and kind of developed the framework for ideological framework for it, really dug up these notions from other sources at the grassroots level. Most people who supported or at least acquiesced to the Holocaust did so because of this very classical anti-Jewish notion that perdured in Christianity for centuries. And as the late Father Edward Flannery in his book, The Anguish of the Jews, said, probably accounted for approximately 1 million Jewish deaths over the course of Christian history.
I want to turn our attention then to Pope Pius XII, who served the church as Pope from 1939 to 1958. As you know, he remains a very controversial figure to this day. There are those that said he could have done much more, and others who say that under the circumstances, Pope Pius XII did all that he could. You yourself have been very critical of the book Hitler's Pope, and you felt that it was an exaggerated and deceptive book. Now, 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, the archive of Pope Pius XII is being opened to scholars. Do you believe that we are apt to learn anything about the papacy of Pope Pius as a result of the recent opening of the Vatican archives? What do you think we're going to learn from that?
Well, I don't know that there will be any smoking gun, as some would put it. I think we already have a fairly good picture of what the problem was with his papacy regarding the Nazi effort to completely obliterate the Jewish community. Pius XII came from a consummate political family. His father was in the Italian Foreign Service. Right after ordination, he went to the Vatican School for training Vatican diplomats. He didn't have a whole lot of pastoral experience, almost none. And I think he thought as a pope, as a diplomat, would think about his responsibilities to the country he or she represents. Now, so he thought primarily about the self-interests of the church in a time of intense struggle and challenge for everyone under the Nazis, including the churches. So he believed his principal obligation was to keep the church alive. Was he an inveterate anti-Semite? There's little evidence. We can tell. There's little. We might be able to tell more from the archives, but there's not much evidence that he was what I would call an inveterate anti-Semite. Did he share this anti-Jewish theological heritage that I just talked about? Of course he did. There's no. I think he clearly did share that. He did try on a small level to take some steps towards the end of the Nazi era and doing it behind the scenes. But he just decided he was not going to jeopardize his primary responsibility was that of keeping the church alive during the Nazi era. I think for that reason, he is not a great moral giant, and for that reason, I don't think he should be canonized. And there are people who, I've been part of a group of Catholic scholars who have intervened with the Vatican in that regard. I could say, though, that a cardinal in the church who was very close to where you and I sit, himself was someone who did not feel that Pius XII did what he should have done during the Holocaust. And of course, I speak of Cardinal Francis George, who once told me in a personal discussion that what we needed during the period of the Holocaust was a prophet as Pope, and we got a diplomat. And for that reason, I have reason to believe that Cardinal George did make an intervention with the Vatican against the canonization of Pius XII, which has now been on hold for quite a long time.
There are those who would look at Pope Pius as a collaborator. While he was trying to protect the church, he, in a sense, collaborated with the Nazis.
Well, I think collaboration would be too strong a term. I think, he certainly is critiqued for pushing the German Catholics to support a formal treaty with the Nazi government, and for destroying the what is called the Center Party in Germany, which was largely Catholic, not exclusively so, and which had great moral qualms about at first about any such kind of concordat with Hitler. That's probably the strongest example of where you might be able to call him a collaborator. And we still need some, but he kind of felt, again, this is where this being primarily a diplomat, a diplomat often thinks of compromises. I just reviewed a book on Vatican diplomacy, and, you get this feeling, well, this is the most we can do in this situation. And I think that's the way that Pius XII thought. I mean, there's some evidence that he hid some Jewish children at his summer home in Castel Gandolfo and so on. But these efforts on the part of Pius really came rather late in the Nazi era and really were kind of marginal. Pius XII was actually bitterly attacked by many in Poland for abandoning Poland to and making the same kind of compromise when in terms of the use of German in the parts of Poland that were captured and which became officially a part of Germany during the war. So there were some very strong critiques of Pius XII by Polish Catholics.
It's a very, very important response, and I don't know that I was aware of that myself. You know, in some ways, if you look at the history of the church since 1945, it's a remarkable history between Nostra Aetate and then going forward with the recognition of Israel and even a visit to the Jewish state, and the kind of relations that actually exist between Catholics and Jews are really exemplary in the kind of dialogue that's going on. I'm really been so impressed over the years with the church's willingness to, what I would say, involve itself in an act of tshuva, and not only to think about the past, but to go through a real transformation within itself and take some very strong stands, and I think very controversial within the church itself. And I really want to take a moment to applaud that because it is remarkable.
You're quite correct. The late Canadian theologian Gregory Baum, who was a Peritas, an expert at the council, and some say actually wrote by hand the first draft of what became Chapter 4 on the Jews and the Jewish people, Judaism and the Jewish people in Nostra Aetate. Now, I put that question directly to Baum, whom I knew fairly well, and he never gave me a straight answer. But anyway, he later said at one of the meetings of the Catholic Theological Society, actually was here in Chicago, that he considered Chapter 4 of Nostra Aetate the most significant change in the ordinary teaching of the church to come out of Vatican II, precisely because it really turned the Adversus Judaeus tradition that I spoke about earlier. It really turned it overturned it and completely rejected it. And you're right, there were those who objected to that. The Nostra Aetate, as well as the document on religious liberty, almost went down the tubes at Vatican II. We really have to give credit to Pope Paul VI for keeping it on the agenda. Now, in the end, when they voted on these two documents in the final session of Vatican II in the fall of 1965, they passed with tremendous approval. I mean, there were, you might say, only a handful of negative votes. So they won the day. Actually, one of the key people who played a very major role behind the scenes in that came from Chicago. His name was Monsignor George Higgins, and he was the longtime director. He worked for a long time in what was originally called the Catholic, I forget it was created after World War I, and then it kind of evolved into the Office of Justice and Peace at the Bishops' Conference in Washington. But Monsignor Higgins was also the chair of the Catholic Jewish National Advisory Committee at the Bishops' Conference. And he, during the council, he had Sunday night meetings for many of the bishops, explaining particularly these two documents, Nostra Aetate and the document on religious liberty, and really won over many of the American bishops in terms of support for these two documents. Although Monsignor Higgins always said there probably would not have been a Nostra Aetate. It was not for the unanimous, almost, I think it was, one can say, unanimous support in the council for this document from the American hierarchical delegation.
That's a powerful statement.
And they were also...
It does speak to the Jewish Catholic dialogue, but I would be remiss, because we're almost out of time.
Sure.
I would be remiss if we didn't talk about modern anti-Semitism and its resurgence. not only in the United States, but around the world. Just last Wednesday in Poland, the right-wing Polish government is making plans to deny individual Jews the opportunity to fight for land that was lost during the Shoah. How do you explain this worldwide phenomenon? Let me ask this, let me start this way. Does it surprise you?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think because this legacy of anti-Semitism became so rooted over almost 2,000 years in Christian consciousness, it's not going to go away easily. People and groups who want to promote it, sometimes for reasons other than religious, political reasons, social hatred reasons, so on. We'll turn to it and draw upon it. So I think that it doesn't entirely surprise me, but it troubles me greatly. Now, I have always said, even to certain Jewish friends who said, well, I'm not going to get too concerned about what Christians might do to try to evangelize Jews or something, as long as I live in a society where they can't harm me for remaining a Jew because of the laws of civil society. I have said, I think, though, that's not adequate. I think we in the Christian community have to work still to eliminate any seeds of anti-Semitism or other forms of social hatred from our tradition. If we don't, then I think that compromises our ability for our religious tradition to become what I think it needs to become, a source of justice and mercy for people who are suffering from various hatred ideologies around the planet. So I think it's cleansing our own tradition, and I think until we get rid of those seeds, even though in secular democratic societies they might not be able to be applied as they once were, nonetheless, I don't feel safe on this question until we really remove them. But one of the things right now is we really need to stand up clearly and decisively against this resurgence of anti-Semitism. Some of the images that I'm sure you have seen, I have seen on the internet in connection with COVID-19 are horrendous, and they definitely pick up on these old themes of, what the Jews are responsible for in terms of finance and so on and so forth. And why Jews have anything to do with COVID-19, I mean, in the sense of being the perpetrators, I have a hard time figuring it out. But there is a social hatred out there. Now, the one I think we have to stand up and urge our governments, our international bodies to really take a stand against this anti-Semitism. Earlier today, I joined a webinar with a person who works for the American Jewish Committee in this area. And she really, somewhat surprisingly, the title of the webinar was, is the United Nations an ally or a foe of anti-Semitism? Mm. And, many in the Jewish community correctly say that a lot of what the at least parts of the United Nations have done and said really might aided and abetted anti-Semitism. But she put out a much more hopeful picture that now starting with Kofi Annan, there has really been a change, and that there is a new report on anti-Semitism from the UN that just came out, and she says it's the strongest statement that she's ever seen out of UN office.
Well, that's a hopeful note to end on. Father, we are so very grateful to you for making the time to speak with us and to be with us on this Yom HaShoah. And we just can't thank you enough, not only
Well,
for
it's
the time this
my-
evening, but for all the work that you
my responsibility in light of the history. And it's always a delight working with you, Rabbi Siegel.
I appreciate you saying that. And, you know, we didn't know how this was going to work out, trying to do this on Zoom video, but at one point we had 107 separate households on our call. So I'm really very grateful.
So I hold the record, huh?
Well, for us, you do actually. You did set the record. I'm going to end the evening with words that I think we should keep in mind. Ani ma'amin, I believe with complete faith. And these are the words that so many of our brothers and sisters went to their deaths on their lips. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin. Can you let Liz and Naomi sing with me, please? Or let them lead, please?
Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, be'emunah shlema, HaMashiach, ani ma'amin, ve'af al pi she'yitmamea, im kol zeh ani ma'amin.
I believe with complete faith in the coming of the Messiah. I believe in the coming of the Messiah. And even though the Messiah may tarry, nonetheless, I will wait for the Messiah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope we'll see some of you tomorrow as we read Megillat HaShoah. And next week, we have the great privilege of celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut. And we're going to be doing this in a wonderful way. Each night of the week, we're going to be celebrating some aspect of Israel. And I'm very proud to note that Yossi Klein Halevi will be joining me next Wednesday on the 29th for a Zoom dialogue just like this. Again, everyone, thank you for being with us, and may the memory of the 6 million remain an inspiration for us to make a better world and to prevent such genocide in the future. Good evening.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Father John, for all your insights and thoughts to tonight's program.
Well, my
Thank you, and thanks so much.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Father John.
Thank you.
Thank you.